In January 2018, The Australian published Caroline Overington's opinion piece condemning DFAT for funding a modest fashion exhibit in Malaysia. Overington criticised modest fashion as being grotesque and linked it to misogyny, violence and terror. Hijab House, Australia's premier modest fashion brand, was quick to publicly respond to these criticisms using social media.
We decided to use a very powerful tool, which is humour, to really bring light to the issue and bring light to Caroline's incorrect opinion. We did that by using social media, which is very powerful. We uploaded beautiful images of our models and very fashionable photos as well that many non-Muslims don't really associate with modest fashion. So we used floral and bright colors and edgy kind of models, and we actually labeled them all as grotesque. I was shocked because Caroline Overington is a mainstream journalist. She's not fringe. She doesn't really represent a small proportion of society. She represents a wider, feminist, sector of society.
There are more than 750 million Muslim women in the world, making the modest fashion industry worth more than $300 billion. Hijab House is one of the world's largest modest fashion brands. It was created in 2010 to provide stylish modest clothing for young Muslim women both in Australia and worldwide. Tara Kusha is the CEO of Hijab House.
So we opened Hijab House 5 to 6 years ago because there was a massive gap in the modest fashion industry. Not many people remember this time, but before Hijab House started, there was no modest fashion industry. It was virtually non-existent. Back then, it was mostly driven by styles from overseas that were dated and mostly were driven by the tastes of males, because most fashion companies overseas in Muslim countries are run by men, not women. And so we really decided to disrupt the market. And I remember we had a collection called You're Late for Tea. It was one of our first collections, and it was very pink and floral and over the top and feminine, and it was a massive game changer for Hijab House because we revolutionized the modest fashion industry. Back then, no one wore floral hijabs. But fast forward 5 years, people now can't imagine a modest fashion industry without floral scarves. It's become such a staple. Hijab House wouldn't exist without this new generation of Muslim women that really drive the industry, and I'm so proud to be working alongside many of them and for them as well. Hijab House has impacted the lives of many young Australians, both Muslim and non-Muslim, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's really opened up a dialogue on modest fashion, and it's allowed a lot of non-Muslims, for example, to understand what it means to wear the hijab and how freeing and how liberating it is rather than oppressive. Obviously there's the fashion benefits. I mean, just for a young Muslim girl in Australia to identify with a brand in her country is so empowering. Don't forget, a lot of these young women are trying to cling on to their faith while also living in a Western community or a Western country that doesn't really understand them. So for us to exist for them is so important. So I think more and more Hijab House's product range and designs are reflecting the needs of a woman that can't fill in a wardrobe with the current fashion industry. So we like to design things that are in sync with other brands as well.
Julianne and Sheng are one of the many faces of hijab fashion in Australia. They model for Hijab House and other major modest fashion brands and have quite a large following on social media. Both Julianne and Sheng believe that the modest fashion boom in Australia in the past few years demonstrates just how great of a need it was for the Australian Muslim female population.
Yeah, I definitely think that there, was and is a need for modest fashion in Australia. We have a large Muslim population here. Like I myself, I didn't really used to live in areas, and I still don't live in areas with Muslim majority. So I wasn't around all those shops. So I would go to your typical shops and then just get pieces to try and work it around, and it could be difficult to try and find like appropriate pieces that were modest enough. We have to change sizes and what have you. Like big fashion brands like Marc Jacobs and what have you, like now they're all displaying and Gucci, whichever, Versace, what have you, they literally all put the hijab in one way or another into their runway.
When I first started like dressing more modest, it was very hard because clothes was like the love of my life, and at that time, it was about 2 years ago, there wasn't really anything that appealed to me that was modest. And since probably the end of last year or the beginning of last year, when modest fashion started becoming very, very popular, it gave me ideas to play around with pieces, not just from Muslim clothing, but more from your westernized Zara, H&M.